Imperial Yeast has been up to some interesting things lately, and they recently announced a product we are super excited about. If you're familiar with Imperial Yeast, you're likely aware of their classification system. A is for ale as an A07 flagship, L is for lager as an L17 harvest, and so on. Well, they recently released the first strain in their I series, which stands for Imperialis and refers to non-GMO hybrids or derivative yeast strains developed by Imperial Yeast that have been honed to exhibit the traits today's brewers most desire. The initial offering, I-22 Capri, is a hybrid of A38 Juice and A43 Loki, two of Imperial's most popular strains for hop-forward IPA. Whether you're into this style or just enjoy juicier fermentation characteristics, you have got to try I-22 Capri. Learn more about the Imperialis project and I-22 Capri at imperialyeast.com. In the world of beer, there are a number of easily recognizable styles. You know, hazy IPA, West Coast IPA, red IPA, brown IPA, stuff like that, of course. And then there's a subset of styles that don't seem to get nearly as much attention, which may very well be a function of their history, though is certainly no reflection of their deliciousness. You are listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this short and shoddy episode to talk about the wonderfully lesser-known style of Czech Amber Lager is contributor Will Lovell.
Yeah, so for those that don't know me, like amber and dark lagers really are kind of my jam, for lack of a better word. I love drinking them, and then after a trip to Prague, I kind of got a special place in my heart for Czech Amber Lager, which is kind of funny because the only commercial examples I've ever had of this beer style have been in the city of Prague. And so to focus on it as a homebrewing scale, it seemed to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I've been drinking and brewing long enough at this point that I'm almost certain I've at least sampled every style covered in the BJCP guidelines, you know, whether commercial or brewed by a friend of mine, though there are a few that I've never had commercial examples of, just homebrew, and I'm pretty sure Czech Amber Lager is one of them. Either way, I absolutely love the versions of this style that I have had, and I look forward to chatting about it with you today, Will, as well as your attempt to make one using short and shoddy methods. Now, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our guest for this month, March of 2023, is well-regarded brew tuber Trent Musho of The Brew Show channel. If you haven't checked this channel out yet, you really should. His videos cover everything from brewing methods like brew in a bag to making unique non-beer recipes like hop water. On top of being killer content, his production quality is awesome, which is something we really appreciate over here at Brewlosophy. Trent will be hanging out with patrons on Saturday, March 25th, 2023, so you have to make your pledge of just $3 or more at patreon.com/Brewlosophy no later than that Friday the 24th. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. You can learn more about becoming a patron and check out all of the rewards we offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your experience will not change at all. You won't even notice a difference, and we end up getting a little bit of a commission for that referral. Now, if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd appreciate that as well. Last I checked, we were less than 20 reviews away from hitting that, golden 1,000 review milestone, which doesn't really matter. It's not going to change anything on our end, but it just makes us feel good. It's like I said, it's a neat milestone, and your 2 minutes of leaving a review would really help us get there. So cheers to everybody who has already taken the time to do that. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who in addition to having a badass YouTube channel chock full of great brewing related content, sell what we believe to be some of the best electric systems on the market. If you've been considering making the move from propane to electric, you owe it to yourself to check out Clawhammer Supply. Whether you're after a 120 volt 5-gallon unit or something bigger like their powerful 240 volt system, Clawhammer has got you covered. Learn more about everything that they have to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to check out their YouTube channel as well. Listener Peter Housen wrote in with some feedback after hearing something he, disagreed with a bit on our last Brew and A episode. Peter said, "No, you guys made the assertion that bars and breweries writ large do not have the time to run BLC, which is beer line cleaner, through all of their taps. Any decent brewery or bar worth their tap handles will clean all of the lines at least every other week, if not weekly. The Brewers Association Beer Serving Manual is very specific in setting standards for serving systems. At the brewery where I work, we have a front of house person who's tasked with cleaning every other week, and she frequently overachieves and hits them every week. And we have 15 taps. It is a point of pride for any decent tap room to have clean lines. All right, Peter, your email made me realize that I could have been a little bit more clear with my comment in that episode. I was not referring at all to craft beer bars and breweries, but your standard run-of-the-mill bar where I think the good majority of people have experienced maybe, less than good beer or quality beer. So my experience with local brewery tap rooms, bottle shops, and the like is that they do take beer line and faucet cleaning very seriously, to the point they are running BLC through their lines multiple times per week, even at some of these places. And on, at least every time they change out a keg or once weekly if those kegs aren't blowing too fast. And honestly, I'm sure there are some standard pubs who do the same exact thing. So if I came off as making some assertion that most don't care about this stuff, I do apologize. That is not what I meant.
Well, and I'm happy to hear that his tap room that he works at does clean them so often. I know that I've had the experience where I've gone to like a kind of an old bar, and definitely even on the Miller Lite tap, you definitely thought there might have been some line taint going on. And so I hope that most breweries and tap rooms are cleaning it more often than not, but I have definitely had the experience of going into some place that probably wasn't the most upscale beer drinking place anyways, and getting a little bit of that line taint on a few of their taps.
Yeah, it sucks. I've actually had beers served to me, a very specific memory. In fact, it was a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, the old classic green label, and the pint came to me and it was god awful. I mean, it tasted so bad. And so I went back to the bar, as opposed to I was at a restaurant, right? And I went back to the bar and was like, hey, can I just get a refill on this? And that beer tasted equally as bad. And I just it reminded me of unclean lines that I've experienced before in the past. And yeah, you got to clean those lines. So again, if I sent the message that I think the majority of breweries and people who actually care about beer aren't cleaning their lines, that wasn't my intention. So thank you for the email, Peter. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. When we return from this break, our focus will be on Czech Amber Lager.
Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Xchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Xchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Xchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to Xchillerator.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today.
There is no denying that I am partial to certain styles of beer, and while I definitely have an appreciation for every style out there, there's just something about crisp, clear lager that does it for me. Now, typically, these types of beers tend to be pale yellow in color, but not always. Such is the case with the style we're going to be focusing on today of Czech Amber Lager, which has its origins there. It doesn't go too deep. Now, obviously, I think, styles like Czech Amber Lager were being brewed long before we're really aware. But what we can read about online seems to indicate that it was basically influenced by popular Vienna Lager, which does have a pretty, a deep history over in Europe. But it's just made with Czech ingredients. So, I can imagine like some brewer had a Vienna Lager and was like, well, we can do that, but all we've got is Satz hops and this Moravian Pilsner malt or whatever, and we'll just make our own version of it. And that's what ultimately, in my understanding, is that's the kind of the origin story of Czech Amber Lager.
So the Czech word for this beer is Polatmavý pivo, which pivo just means beer, but Polatmavý, please email me if I butchered that too badly. It just means half dark.
Right.
And so it makes sense that we're really familiar with like Bohemian Pils and then also Czech dark lager. And those both seem to be even more popular in the U.S. than Czech Amber. But it makes sense that if you had something kind of in between, you would just call it the half dark option.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, I feel like some languages are a little bit more pragmatic, if you will, than English. And half dark is literally what they're saying, I believe, is this is the in between Czech pale lager or Czech premium pale lager, which is used to be called Bohemian Pilsner. That's like your Pilsner Urquells and such. And Czech dark lager. This is the in between, and it looks very similar. If you've ever had one, whether home brewed or commercial, it does look very similar to Vienna Lager. It has that same color, and in many ways, it has a similar style description, which we're going to get into now. So in terms of appearance, Czech Amber Lager, you'd expect it to be deep amber to copper in color. And just a side note, we get this information direct from the BJCP. That's kind of one of the things we do with the Short and Shoddy series on the Brewlosophy podcast. So deep amber to copper in color, clear to bright clarity. This is not a hazy style of beer. It is a lager after all, and with a large off-white persistent head. And that doesn't sound too different from a Vienna Lager to me, Will. Maybe it does to you.
No, I kind of associate Czech Amber with maybe having we haven't gotten a flavor, but maybe appearance wise, they should be very similar.
Yeah.
And like almost all lagers, I like to see through them. I think we share that in common, and that clear, like amber to copper hued color just coming through a beer is just so wonderful to see.
Could not agree more. I think it is one of the more beautiful styles of beer to look at. Aromatically speaking, you're looking for a moderately intense, rich, bready malt aroma with some Maillard and or caramel sweetness. The Maillard thing is interesting because it does take some pretty high temperatures to achieve that. And we're going to talk about, traditional brewing techniques, and you'll see where that may come from when we get there. But that Maillard thing is kind of that toasty, kind of caramely toasty characteristic that you get when you fry something in a frying pan or you toast your bread or whatever. Moderate to no spicy floral herbal hops. Light diacetyl, they say, is optional. I would just say try to avoid that. I don't know why anybody would intentionally try to get diacetyl in their beer, but it is optional, I suppose. And then very low fruity esters are acceptable. I'm not sure if those fruity esters are a function of the Satz hops, which are customary in this style, or if it's a fermentation thing, because typically you're going to ferment these pretty cold.
Yeah, my experience with most Czech lager yeast is that, if you treat them right, you shouldn't get too much in the way of fruity esters. I mean, it can happen, obviously. So, but I agree that Satz definitely does put off kind of a citrus thing. And so I think that may be just where it comes from.
Yeah, likewise. So flavor-wise, you're looking for it to basically follow the aroma and flavor, medium to medium high, complex, rich Maillard and or caramely sweet character, candy-like or graham cracker malt in some examples, and I think that's just a function of the type of malt that you're using in the kilning process that malt went under. Prominent but clean hop bitterness to balance sweetness of the beer because of the specialty grains that get used in this style. Low to moderate spicy hop flavor. Subtle plum or berry esters, again, are optional. I have to imagine that's a function of the yeast that's being used, but that maybe a combination of the fermentation character with the hops and the malt. I don't know, but plum or berry is optional. No roasted malt flavor, which is key. This is not supposed to taste like a stout, or you don't want any coffee characteristics or anything like that. You want color from malts that are obviously kilned or roasted, but aren't going to impart that characteristic. characteristic to the beer. And in the flavor, low diacetyl, again, is optional. My suggestion would be just try to avoid that.
I agree on the diacetyl option as well. Let's keep that optional and not actually functional. But the roasted malt flavor, if you start getting roast, if you look at the BJCP guidelines, like the color comes almost right up to Czech dark lager. And so when you start getting like kind of darker versions of this with roasty character, you start to kind of bleed over into that style or maybe a Schwarzbier kind of style. And so I would say flavor wise, to me, this maybe is a little, not much, but maybe a little richer, maybe a little fuller than a Vienna lager, but not by very much. And I kind of like a little bit of that crystal malt sweetness, especially if it's a very well balanced beer.
Yeah, that's a good point. In comparing it to Vienna lager, which I believe it was inspired by, I expect Vienna lager to have kind of a dry thing that's not too sweet, more of a nutty, toasty thing. And if anybody's ever brewed the very simple Vienna lager recipe that I prefer, it's 98% Pils malt with 2% pale chocolate malt, which just contributes that color and nuttiness. I expect Czech Amber Lager to have a little bit more sweetness to it. And so, or we'll call it complexity. And then that presents as a kind of a sweetness at times. And that's perfectly appropriate. It's expected in Czech Amber Lager. So I agree. In terms of mouthfeel, we're looking for medium full to medium body, soft and round with a gentle creaminess, the BJCP says, and moderate to low carbonation. I'm going for a moderate to moderate high carbonation because that's how I like my lagers. But again, this is a little bit richer, fuller style. So that lower carbonation can work.
I'm with you. I tend to carbonate my stuff kind of that moderate to moderate high. Anyways, that's just kind of where my lines are set on my system. So, but everything there is pretty spot on.
Yep. Let's get into some of the vital stats for Czech Amber Lager. You're looking for 1044 to 1060 OG. That is about the same as Czech Premium Pale Lager and Czech Dark Lager. I mean, I really think the biggest difference here is the color and what comes from the ingredients that you use to achieve those colors. FG, you're looking to finish at 1013 to 1017 for a ABV range of 4.4 to 5.8%. I mean, that is just like, that's my wheelhouse right there. I love that ABV. IBU, you're looking at 20 to 35 IBU with an SRM of 10 to 16. That 10 to 16, again, is going to give you that kind of like light copper to dark amber color without being brown or black. And that's what you're looking for. So characteristic ingredients used to make Czech Amber Lager. It's pretty obvious on this one and not terribly convoluted. You are going to use Pilsner malt from the Czech Republic or Moravian Pilsner malt. And I think if you're trying to make it to style, historically accurate at least, you're going to source, your Pilsner malt from the region within which this beer is brewed. And so that's the way you can do it. Do you have to use that style of malt? I think a good majority of the Czech Amber Lagers that I've had, that I've made myself, as well as that my brewing buddies have made, has been made with, like Weirmann Pilsner malt and stuff. So, it's not a necessity, but I think traditionally that's what you're looking to use.
Right. And I think also if you can't get a hold of some Czech Moravian Pilsner malt or anything like that, I've also seen some people will throw in a little bit of Maris Otter with some just normal Pilsner malt just to kind of provide that little wrinkle in there. Just to kind of coax some more of that base malt complexity out. Absolutely.
And now the thing, because of the color of this beer and the characteristics you expect from it because of that color, you are going to use a set of specialty grains as well. Caramel malt is very, very normal in this style of beer. Now, that is not something you typically see, or at least that I typically see or use in my Vienna lager recipes. So this is a slight diversion. I know some people who do. I'm not saying you can't. But that is where you're going to pick up a little bit of that more sugary sweetness in this style. And Vienna and Munich malts are also perfectly acceptable in this beer. In fact, I had a Czech Amber Lager that a buddy of mine sent to me that was, he didn't use, I think he did a 50-50 split for his base malt of Vienna and Pilsner malt. And it came out beautifully as well. So those are both perfectly acceptable. No adjuncts. This is not a style. I mean, some people might throw in some flaked corn to lighten up the body or something, or you can use some dextrose, but that is not historically something that this style is known for. It is an all malt beer, so no adjuncts that you're going to toss into the mash. And I think the most obvious ingredient here, and what really distinguishes it from other styles of amber lager, is when it comes to the hops. So we're going to use, what hop are we going to use in this beer?
I mean, I think when I think traditional Czech hops, I think Sats is basically the gold standard. I'm not sure I can name many other Czech hops.
Yeah.
And Sats actually happens to be in like my top 5 favorite hops of all time. So this works out well for me, and probably why I like this style as well.
Yeah, I don't know many people who don't appreciate Sats hop character, especially when used. I think a part of it is because they are used in such crushable styles like, Pilsner and such. So use Sats hops. If you find some other Czech, traditional Czech hop or something like that, you can try that out. But Sats is just such a wonderful hop when used in styles like this. So,
oh man, all that wonderful citrus character you get from it. It's just, and then the spiciness, like it's actually very complex for what it is. And like any single hop beer with Sats is going to be worthwhile.
Yeah, what blows my mind is that it's now on the map again. I mean, it's never really left the map, but because of the apparent, concentration of bound thiols. So a lot of people who are into this on this kind of thiol trend are using Sats in their hoppy beers, using thiolized yeast and such, because apparently those yeasts will unlock those bound thiols, and you get a really tropical, fruity characteristic from using a otherwise noble hop, which I think is really interesting. So, well, moving on, in terms of yeast, again, you're going to stick with a Czech lager yeast. People need to remember that these lager yeasts it's not like the people in Czech Republic when they were inventing Pilsner were like, oh, we've got these different strains to choose from this lab down the street. No, they used what happened to work there. And those strains, I mean, they're not terribly different. If you use them side by side, again, there are going to be people out there up in arms about this. But if you go with something like Imperial Yeast, their L28 Urkel, which is ostensibly sourced from Pilsner Urquell, and you use you compare that in a Czech Amber Lager to something like their L13 Global, chances are it's not going to be a huge difference. It's not going to knock it out of style. But there are, because these yeast strains are used for Pilsner Urquell, it is widely embraced that these are the yeast strains that should be used for making Czech lagers, including Czech Amber Lager. That would be things like Imperial Yeast L28 Urkel, Y Yeast 2278 Czech Lager, WLP, that's his White Labs WLP 800 Pilsner Lager, or their WLP 802 Czech Budějovice Lager, which is, I believe, the original Budweiser strains. So those are the
good
yeast.
Old Budvar, man.
Yeah, oh, it's so good, right? That's another premium pale lager from Czech Republic that is phenomenal.
And I would just like to add, like, I think for most people, including myself, like which I have done side by sides with different lager yeasts, like there is a difference, but it is significantly less notable going lager yeast, like you said, L13 to L28 than say doing 2 different ale yeasts. So that's just something to keep in mind.
All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the traditional brewing process, the standard approach. Oftentimes when we get to this section on these short and shoddy episodes, we're saying things like, well, they don't really do much different to make say an English, mild that you would to make pretty much any other beer that a home brewer or commercial brewer in America would employ. Such is not the case when it comes to styles like, Czech lagers. And so there are some differences that we should note. First off, in terms of water chemistry, this is a place where, I think that Czech Republic is quite known for having very, very soft water with minimal sulfate, carbonate, and calcium chloride levels. And so you want to emulate that. So if you can get RO water and build it up to a kind of a balanced, sulfate to chloride ratio type of thing that's relatively soft, I think you're going to have more success creating a Czech Amber Lager that is more in line with what you might get over in the Czech Republic.
I would agree with that. I mean, the main thing that separates a lot of Czech styles from German styles and other lager styles is, again, water profile, and just, again, people building recipes around what they had available. And as you know, living where you live, soft water is a great luxury to have.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm lucky enough to have soft water at my house for the majority of the year, at least. And it really is. You have, the world is your playground, as it were, when you have soft water. So when you're brewing a Czech Amber Lager, try to keep it balanced, relatively, you're not adding a bunch of gypsum and calcium chloride to this water. You're going to mash for, your standard 60 to 90 minutes. You can do a single infusion, but one of the areas where these melanoidins and that Maillard character is said to develop is during a decoction mash. And we have to remember, again, I know a lot of people are adamantly convinced that a decoction contributes some sort of flavor to beer. Whether you agree with that or not, the reason that this method was developed ostensibly was because to encourage better conversion of the malt. They had under-modified malts back then. Moravian malts, to this day, I believe, are still known for not being terribly modified, at least not as hot as the stuff that we get over here, from our big maltsters. And so doing a decoction helped them to coax more conversion, more sugar out of those grains. So it made sense on a practical level to do it. Now, maybe it does contribute an additional layer of melanoidin or Maillard flavor as well. And so that's one way you could achieve that. If you're going to brew a traditional Czech Amber Lager, chances are you're going to be decocting a double or triple decoction.
Right. And by starting out with a lower temperature and raising up over kind of a ramping, rate going up over time, we know that you're hitting at a lot of different like protein rests and different enzymatic rests. And so we know that there are things happening. Whether or not it matters with modern maltsters, as you said, it's debatable. But still, again, like you said, traditional, you're going to go with a decoction mash and get it going that way.
Yep, exactly. Once your mash is complete, you're going to boil that wort for at least 90 minutes because you used Pilsner malt, and so you need to drive off all that SMM and DMS. You don't want a corny beer, as they say. So again, an extended boil to drive off the DMS, and then you are going to quickly chill the wort to ensure a very good cold break. All of which, all of that trub, you are going to leave behind in the kettle. In fact, I know some people, one of whom is our own Jordan Folks, who will rack the wort into a settling vessel, let it settle for a period of time, and then rack that wort into his fermentation vessel. And that the whole idea is to get that wort as clean as possible before you oxygenate and pitch your yeast.
I love Jordan. I think obviously he's a great brewer. He's got the medals to prove it. And I love his voice here in Brewlosophy for those of us that are so willing to like throw caution to the wind. And we have the guy that's like old school, got to do it the right way. And so I love the fact that he still does this. I wish I could say I was as disciplined.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I love having him around to bounce ideas off of, given his perspective being, quite a bit different than I think what the majority of listeners and readers of our stuff view our perspectives as being. I still totally appreciate those more classic ways of brewing. Anyways, this is a lager, so when it comes to fermentation, you're going to chill that wort, you're going to pitch cool, and so we're talking like 46 degrees Fahrenheit, for pitching temperature, which is about 8 degrees Celsius, and then you're going to ferment it at 48 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 9 to 11 Celsius with that traditional lager strain that we talked about earlier. You will ferment this beer out at that cold temperature. Traditionally, I'm not sure they were doing ramping of temperatures or anything like that. They would just hold it at that cooler temp for multiple weeks and then very gently lager the beer. And traditionally, the way lagering happened is that the temperature of the beer would be gradually reduced. And it was during that reduction that this magic that happens during lagering occurs. You're going to let that beer cold condition for another, 4 to 8 weeks or however long the brewer decides to let that beer sit cold, which is going to make it clear. And that is something that, again, we expect in a Czech Amber Lager. This is not supposed to be a hazy beer, but that clarity comes from the lagering process. It does not come from finings. It does not come from filtering. I'm sure there are modern, craft breweries in the Czech Republic today making Czech Amber Lager that's super bright because they filter it. But from a classic perspective, a classic approach, you're just going to lager it. And one of the signs that it's ready to drink is that it's clear.
Right. I would think that, in a more traditional sense, this would probably be, you said 4+ weeks, but maybe 6-8 weeks.
Yeah.
And, in some cool, nice, calm place, just let all that, anything in suspension just fall out, become nice, bright, copper hued or amber hued beer.
Yep, exactly. And when it is done, when that beer is clear, it gets, you're going to rack it to whatever serving vessel, whether that's bottles or a keg, and both are appropriate. And you're going to carbonate it to a moderate level. I probably 2.2 to 2.4 volumes, 2.2 to 2.4 volumes of CO2. I'm going to push it up to 2.6 or so because that's what I prefer. But that lower carbonation will allow some of those flavors to be different, to be experienced differently on your palate. And then from there, it should look good. It should be clear, amber, beautiful, nice creamy head, all of the good stuff that we talked about earlier. And hopefully it tastes delicious as well. Now, what to look for in a good example? If we put everything together, what are we expecting in a good example? I am expecting very clean fermentation. I don't really want to notice any of the kind of classic fermentation esters, that kind of red apple thing or a perry note. I don't really want to notice that in this beer. I want to taste toasty, caramely malt, flavors and aromas with hints of spicy floral and herbal hops from the sots that just washes off my palate, maybe leaves a little bit of a toasty character so that I just want that next sip.
I would 100% agree. I like this beer to finish clean so that I can go back and get some more of that bready and caramely toasty goodness, and then just keep going back sip after sip. That's really what I want for this. Is something with a little more body and backbone than say a Bow Pils, a little more complexity, but something that I can still crush.
Exactly. Now, I said it earlier, I've never had any of the commercial examples. As far as I know, Bernard, I can't even say what, I'm not even going to try to say them. Gambrinus makes one, Bernard makes one, Kozel makes one. They call it the Kozel Semi-Dark. I have a feeling all of those are based out of the Czech Republic. I'm not sure. Will, I know you've actually been to the Czech Republic where you had some Czech Amber Lagers over there. Do you recall the names of those?
So the one place that I remember is the first place I ever had it was at the Strahov Monastic Brewery in Prague, and it's up on the side of this hill. And as you're walking up this really steep hill, you're like, man, I hope it's worth it to get up there. But this gorgeous views going on behind you, kind of the river and Old Town Prague. And I just remember having this Czech Amber Lager there, and I don't even know if I fully remember what it tastes like anymore. But I just other than that, I was really impressed and I really enjoyed it. I didn't have any beer notes. We were on vacation. I wasn't jotting down in a notebook. Maybe I should have. But up to that point, like my impression of Czech beer was stuff like Pilsner Urquell or maybe Budvar. And so to get something like this and then some other dark lagers that I had as well, but that's a different show. I was really floored at the complexity and the variety of beer that was there in Prague.
I am so excited. My wife and I are taking our kids on a 2-week trip to Europe this year. Post-COVID, we got to get out and explore the world again. And one of our stops is going to be in Prague. So I'm absolutely going to be drinking a bunch of delicious lager beers, including Czech Amber Lager. Now, I've had quite a few of homebrewed examples, homebrewed versions, of Czech Amber Lager myself. I absolutely love this stuff. So I'm more excited than I can. It's ineffable, my excitement to go to Prague and actually drink the beer there. But Czech Amber Lager is right up there with some of my favorite styles of beer. Well, you were interested to see how one would turn out when a bunch of corners were cut in the brewing process, and you made a short and shoddy batch of Czech Amber Lager. What did blind tasters think of it? We'll be getting into those results when we're back from this break.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
I have to imagine most brewers, and likely even a good majority of anyone who just enjoys good beer, is familiar with popular Czech premium pale lagers like Pilsner Urquell, a personal favorite of mine. Now, unfortunately, this delicious style's darker cousin, Czech Amber Lager, isn't as familiar, but it's brewed using pretty much the same methods, which is arguably a bit more convoluted than most other styles. Will, you recently made a batch where you didn't quite follow that approach. Why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, so I went a little short and shoddy with it. So I did a full volume brew in a bag and 120 volt Brewzilla electric system. Now, some people ask me, why are you doing a brew in a bag? Because I do put a bag inside of my Brewzilla, and to me, it just makes life easier. You know, if you need to squeeze out that last little bit, and you get a little bit clearer wort into your boil. So it was a brew in a bag inside of my malt pipe. Pre-brew preparation, I like to brew in 2 sets. Like, I like to prep water and grains the night before and then start the next morning. So the night before, I collected a full volume of water. I usually have to go buy RO water, and then I adjusted it to my desired mineral profile. I'm not quite as bold as Marshall as just taking a little handful and sprinkling it in, but maybe I'll get there. I got a short and shoddy coming up. Maybe I'll try it next time.
I believe in you, Will. You'll get there, buddy. You'll get there. Yeah.
I'll get there eventually. So the next morning I awoke, and at 7:15 a.m., thanks to the magic of my Brewzilla, my water was properly heated, so I just mashed in and got things going. The recipe was basically 78% Pilsner malt, 12% Munich malt, 4% chocolate rye malt, 4% medium crystal, and 2% melanoidin malt.
Yeah, so the only weird thing there, very shoddy of you, is the chocolate rye, but I know that you were going for something a little unique because this was a short and shoddy. We talked about that. What was your thinking behind using the chocolate rye malt?
So it's not totally out of left field. I've done a Czech Amber before where I put chocolate rye in a small amount as like kind of a little accent to it. I think the main difference is in that in previous times that I tried it, I kind of split the Pilsner malt 50-50 base with Maris Otter. And so it could be that the roundness of the Maris Otter maybe balanced out the chocolate rye malt a little more, or maybe it was just I got a different brand of chocolate rye this last time from the homebrew store. It's hard to say. And then I also like putting a little bit of melanoid malt in there because it's my lazy man's decoction.
Because decoction imparts melanoid and character. We'll just have to accept that. Okay, so onward with the brew day.
Okay, so the mash was left at 151 Fahrenheit or 66 C for just 30 minutes, after which the grains were removed. And just to point out what Marshall always says here, like that 30-minute mash time, like when you get used to doing 60-minute mashes, or sometimes I'd cut them down to 45, you get used to having time in there to kind of get things done. And so this brew day just flies by, and you just are running out of time over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And it does feel rushed. And so 30 minutes, I know Marshall cuts them down to 20, but 30 was about where I felt comfortable with. And then after that, the grains were removed, and the wort was then boiled for just 30 minutes with a huge charge, 85 grams of Sots at 30 minutes and 35 grams of Sots at 15 minutes.
So I had to do the same thing. I did the Czech Premium Pale Lager, short and shoddy, before this one, and that ended up creating this issue that I actually recently talked with Martin about on the Brewlosophy show, where I thought that the huge charge of Sots that I used, I think I boiled for only 25 minutes. I thought it contributed kind of what I called like a new shoe character to the beer. So I'll be curious to hear what your thoughts are on this. If that big old dose of Sots didn't have some sort of a negative impact on the characteristics of this beer.
Well, and I thought about shortcutting it with Magnum, but it's not a Czech lager without Sots, in my opinion, and so I didn't want to go substituting in some German hop just to circumvent it. So I stayed true to style there, and again, Sots is easily one of my top 5, so not a hard decision.
Yeah.
Okay. So when the boil was complete, I chilled the wort using a jaded Hydra immersion chiller down to 73 degrees Fahrenheit or 23 degrees C, which is about as low as I could get with my groundwater that time of year. A refractometer reading showed that my wort was at 1048, which was a 55 55% brew house efficiency.
That's I got to comment on that because I usually get anywhere between 55 and 65% brew house efficiency. But in my experience, when I'm doing short and shoddy, and in my experience, the lower efficiency is related. It's completely correlated with OG. So I get lower efficiency as my expected OG increases, the more amount of grains I use. 1048 is pretty low. I'm curious I believe this was your first short and shoddy batch, right, Will?
Yes, first fully short and shoddy.
Yeah, so I wonder if it's just not some sort of an artifact of your first experience doing this, and maybe not making, boil off rate was different because brew house efficiency takes into account everything in your brew house. That's why it's called brew house efficiency. So that 55% still doesn't bother me too much. I mean, it's not like you had to use that much more malt or anything, but I wonder if there aren't ways we could bump that up to maybe 60% efficiency at some point, just through, iterative processing.
So I've done at least one short and shoddy since this, and I kind of put in my numbers right at about 55%. And I think I was, I'm trying to remember, it was right around 55% still, maybe a little better. There probably is still some room for improvement, obviously, but again, not a huge deal, just a little bit extra grain. That's all. And then good to go.
Yeah. Well, and just a note, this was done on a 120 volt Brewzilla, as opposed to my short and shoddies that I do on a 240 volt system. So that may be playing into it as well.
I'm never going to get the boil off rate you get with this thing. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So after that, I racked the wort to a fermenter and pitched a single pouch of Imperial Yeast L13 Global into the worm wort. I didn't even cool it down any further than the 73 was already at.
Okay, not only that, sir, but you also used a German lager strain. You did not. That's the Weihenstephan strain, for those who aren't aware. L13 Global. It's very, very popular. In fact, that Weihenstephan lager strain is said to be the most popular lager strain in the world. What were you thinking not using a traditionally Czech yeast strain?
So, partly this is what I had on hand, which is kind of a big thing when you're brewing beers like this, but also I do have a little mileage with the Weihenstephan strain, and I have had pretty good success doing it warmer than normal. I think this might be the highest I've ever pushed it in a lager, and so I was really curious just to see what it would do.
Yeah, I honestly though, I've used Urkel a ton. I've used Global a ton. They are both fantastic strains. I have this weird experience with when I'm pitching just a single pouch of Urkel. That's L28, Imperial Yeast L28. That's the Pilsner Urkel strain. When I pitch that into a wort, it kind of doesn't even matter what the OG of the wort is. It does seem to lag a little bit longer than Global, which you pitch Global and within an hour or so, you're starting to see bubbling in the airlock. So, maybe you're kind of patting, yourself on this one a little bit, assisting the short and shoddy process, as it were.
Well, and I know that, let's just be honest, most of the commercial beers in the U.S. that are lagers are made with the Weihenstephan strain for the most part. Not all, but most.
Yeah.
And it's just a really consistent, great performer with a lot of flexibility, especially as it comes to temperature. I think Brewlosophy's shown that over and over again. So yes, I was kind of patting myself a little bit, just a little bit of safety here.
Totally makes sense, Will.
Okay, so the end time here was at 9:29 a.m. Total brew time on a 110 volt system was 2 hours and 14 minutes. Whew.
That's crazy, man.
110 volt system, man.
For 2 hours and 14 minutes. Now, that doesn't take into account the 20 minutes you spent the day before prepping your grain and your water. So if you add that in, you're at about 2.5 hours. That's still way shorter than a traditional brew day, especially on a 120 volt system. Pretty remarkable.
I think it's great. I love saving time, and especially if you've got kids in the house, short and shoddy brew day is better than no brew day. So after that, I racked into the fermenter. After it was racked in the fermenter and everything was done, I connected my spunding valve, set it to 20 PSI, and then I placed it in a corner basically next to my computer in my office and just left it there at the house temperature, which at that time of year was around 77 F or 25 C.
This is a recipe for failure, buddy. I mean, obviously, right? A 77 degree Fahrenheit lager. Are you kidding me? Now, you did ferment this under pressure. I think I'm going to guess here. You can explain to me if I'm wrong. That a part of the reason you did that, of course, there's the claim that by doing so you're going to suppress ester development. Okay, great. But also, it's just easy to do that. I mean, that is if there's a shoddier method, I guess it would just be to not ferment under pressure. But having that spunning on there takes 2 seconds to put the spunning valve on, and you set it 20 psi and let it rip.
So I'm a huge fan of spunning, and it's not to prevent esters or anything like that. I just love saving money on CO2. And it also helps with the process. So when my beer's out, it's mostly carved when I rack it over after cold crashing. And so typically it's just great that you can just turn the beer around that much faster. So my thought there was, maybe 20 PSI spunning valve doesn't seem short and shoddy on the front end, but it'll make it shorter on the back end by saving CO2 and saving that time to force carb.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so this one was a screaming fast fermentation because I left it to ferment for just 4 days. And then I went all the way from 1048 down to 1007 FG.
That's crazy. In 4 days. Man. That temperature really matters there. Jeez.
I think that's the fastest I've ever attempted to turn around a lager anyways. So that was 5.4% ABV, which is within the BJCP recommendation. I moved the fermenter to my firm chamber where I did cold crash it for 24 hours before pressure transferring the beer to a CO2 purged keg. Because I do like my lagers clear, and I had some kind of other plans for this that we'll talk about later, I gently added gelatin fining at this point and then proceeded to burst carbonate for 12 hours, which then reduced the grass to serving pressure, where it was left to lager for 1 week before serving it to tasters.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. You didn't do a decoction mash. You only mashed for 30 minutes. You only boiled for 30 minutes. Just right there alone, this is short and shoddy and goes against the traditional brewing methods. But then when it was done, you didn't lager it. You fermented it warm, and then you didn't lager it. And you added gelatin fining, and then you burst carbonated it. So all of these things that are just kind of going against the norm. And you had this beer ready. I mean, you brewed it in 2.5 hours, and then it was ready to drink. What was it, a week and a half later, 2 weeks later?
I think it was about 7 days later it was ready to drink. It was under a week that I had this thing kind of cleared up and ready to drink. So, how irreverent am I?
God, it's crazy. And I think you waited 1 more week before you could find tasters to serve it to wherever you did that at. Now, let's talk a little bit about the way this beer looked at the time that you served it to tasters. Based on the picture that I'm looking at right now on the article on brewlosophy.com, it looks mostly clear to the point where I would guess at least that some of the haze is just condensation on the glass, but it has this gorgeous dark copper color, possibly a bit too dark for the style, with a fluffy white head with seemingly great retention.
I would say that if it was within style, it was on the upper end of that. Again, there is a bit of overlap between the Czech Dark and the Czech Amber, and it was definitely on that line of almost not to style. I don't think anybody's going to knock you too hard on the color because it's kind of right there on the edge. But yes, it definitely is a little darker maybe than you'd want to. But yeah, it was a pretty clear beer.
Yeah, I was looking at the recipe file, and the kind of top end of the range for Czech Amber Lager is 16 SRM, and based on the predicted SRM of this recipe, you're at 16 SRM. Just based, on what my experience is with beer and colors, it looks a little bit more like it might be hitting that 8. I've only seen the picture, but it looks like it might be more in that 18 to 20 range. But still, we just have to accept that this is on the darker end of Czech Amber Lager or the paler end of a Czech Dark Lager, color wise at least.
100%. Personal impressions. Yeah, it definitely had a toasty caramel malt flavors, not too much hop aroma or flavor. It was surprisingly clean. So you would have thought that this would have just been a huge ester bomb and at 77 degrees fermentation temp, but it was surprisingly clean. The one thing, though, that I will say is that it did have too much roast, probably from that chocolate rye, than I expected in the beer. And so, and it didn't distract from the drinkability at all. It was a super it was an amazing beer. This thing floated so fast after we got all the tasters, but it was a great beer. In fact, my wife was begging me to brew another one right after this one floated. So
that's awesome. In part because of the fact that you're like, hey, it only took me, grain to glass was less than 2 weeks. Might as well do it. And it only took a 3-hour brew day, and you made this amber lager, darker slightly, amber color than it should have been, but this amber lager that people, or at least you and your wife, seem to enjoy. What did tasters who had no idea how you brewed this beer, they didn't know the blasphemy that you were committing here, you served it to 21 people, again, blind to the brewing method. What did they think about this beer?
So 21 tasters, participants were informed of the style and asked to evaluate based on both previous experiences as well as the BJCP style description, which we provided. The average characteristic rating, in terms of how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer was, tasters seemed to perceive the strongest characteristic as being the beer's dryness, which yielded an average rating of 3.6 out of 5. And then the ratings on malty and hoppiness were tied at about 2.1 out of 5, respectively.
So that's interesting because it lines up fairly well with the Czech Premium Pale Lager. I would have expected in this beer, given the color alone, I would have expected it to the malty rating to have been a little bit higher, maybe not as high as the dryness rating. I really do feel like the dryness in a lager style like this should kind of be that feature component. But surprising to me that the hoppy and malty ratings were both about the same. They were tied at about 2.1. So that's curious. I don't know is that how you perceived it, Will, or?
So the biggest malt character I perceived, there's definitely some caramel malt in there, but that roastiness was kind of the dominant malt character to me. But maybe I was just focusing on that because that's what I knew was out of whack. Because that seems to happen. We focus on what we did wrong, not what we did right. The beer definitely did finish dry. There's no doubt about it. But I might have rated the maltiness a little higher than that, although the hoppiness is probably fine.
Yeah. I just think it's interesting. And like you said, I mean, you're owning it, and we are our own worst critics. It may be that you're just, perceive that malt character as being a little bit stronger, that roast character, just because you know that you use that chocolate rye. So, well, in terms of breaking down each of the ingredient characteristics, 9 out of the 21 tasters, in terms of hop character, 9 out of the 21 noted an earthy hop character, 3 rated spicy, floral, and pine resinous. So that's another 9 tasters altogether. So those again, those ratings were rated by 3 of the blind tasters as being most prominent. One person thought that fruity hop characteristics were the most prominent. Another one rated dank caddy, and another one rated onion garlic. That makes no sense to me because I wouldn't expect any of those characteristics to be from maybe fruity a little bit, but certainly not onion garlic or dank caddy from Czech Sods hops. 0 people noted a melon or berry hop note.
So, I'm not really sure about the fruity and dank caddy. I mean, there's always outliers in anything you do like this. And I don't know, maybe they tasted that. That's their experience. I don't have their palates. But I would have rated it. I think the earthiness and the spicy were kind of spot on. And it may have been just because of the roast malt character. Because again, when you're breaking down, hop character, you're drinking the whole beer, and so there are those other malts and things that influence that. That happens every time. You're right, and people are always like, well, that one person who said onion garlic, like, dude, that's an outlier. Outliers are a normal thing in any sensory or otherwise type of data collection. So in terms of malt character, this is going to kind of jibes with what you described the beer as tasting like, Will, is that 9 out of 21 tasters rated roast as being the most prominent malt characteristic, while 5 rated toasty, another 5 rated nutty. So there's your 19 out of 21 right there. And then 2 people put chocolate, which if you clump chocolate and roast together, that's 11 people who noted a darker grain or darker malt character as being the most prominent in this beer. And that is definitely a fair analysis. Again, I keep harping on it because, again, that's the one thing that was a little bit disappointingly out of style, but that's okay. It still was a great and delicious beer, but I pretty much, the roast and then, again, the toasty and nutty are all pretty well in line with what my experience was. Yeah,
and I'll tell you, what I kind of a secondary interesting finding on this one in terms of malt character is that nobody rated cracker, bread crust, or caramel sweet as being the most prominent malt characteristics in this beer. And I would have expected expected, based on the Czech Amber Lagers that I have had, that I thought were well made at least, as well as what the BJCP describes the style as. I would have expected a few people to rate Caramel Sweet at least, for this beer, and they didn't. They it seems like more than anything, they got that kind of roasty, chocolatey thing that you get from those darker malts. So all good. This is short and shoddy. That's the kind of stuff we expect to see. So the yeast character, 9 out of 21. I can't help but wonder if it was the same 9 people who rated earthy roast character and clean fermentation character, because that consistency is just interesting to me. But 9 out of 21 of the blind tasters rated the fermentation character as just being clean, which is wonderful. 7 people noted phenolic. Now, I have a comment on this that I've made before in the past. When you look up phenols and you look up what are phenolics, some of the descriptors include things like smoky, or roasty, or stuff like that, which are phenols. Don't get me wrong. And so I wonder if some of the tasters read that description, which we include in the survey, and go, well, I taste roasty in this, so it must be phenolic. I have a hard time believing they were tasting cloves, and what you might otherwise expect in, say, a Weiss beer or a Belgian style beer.
I think the roastiness, some people, and my wife included in this, like I'll serve her a roasty stout and she will say that she tastes smokiness or like a kind of a smoke character to it. And so I don't think it's that far of a reach to say that if it was roasty, that there would be a phenolic character.
Yeah, I agree.
Or at least what would be perceived as phenolic character.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, we include that description in the survey, and I do that because that is the descriptor that is used, I believe, by the BJCP, or at least it used to be on competition score sheets. So it's there for a reason, and sometimes we seem to get a more people noting that when in these roasty beers. So whatever it is, based on what you've said though, Will, it's not like you had that kind of like more noticeable phenolic character in this beer, and I trust that. So 4 people did identify esters as being the most prominent yeast characteristic, which I think is interesting. 1 person, I'm going to call that an outlier again, noted wild character, and then 0 people noted sulfur, which is pretty good because Global is known for kind of pushing off, most lager yeast strains are known for pushing off sulfur, but that higher fermentation temperature likely drove it off pretty quickly. In terms of off flavors, only 1 person noted any off flavors, and they wrote musty and phenolic off flavors. It was the same person who put both of those, and then the other 20 people did not notice any off flavors. I think that's pretty sweet.
I think that's amazing. And again, like if it's one person, again, I'm not here to knock their experience or anything that they're doing.
Right.
But if it's one person, that does feel like an outlier. So
yeah. And you think about all of the crazy corners that were cut in making this beer, particularly the fact that it's a lager style. I mean, I would expect DMS, I'd expect diacetyl, I expect massive amount of esters from that warm fermentation temperature. The vast majority, nearly all people noticed none of that stuff. And so I think that, again, it kind of bolsters this idea that you can get away with making we'll see if it's a decent example of the style. Out of the 21 blind tasters, 5 people, when asked how well this represents the style based on what we provided for them, the BJCP description, and if they have any other experience with this style prior to this evaluation, 5 people rated it a 5 out of 5 in terms of how well it represents the style. That's phenomenal to me. And then another 13 gave it a 4 out of 5. And then the final 3 gave it a 3 out of 5. Nobody gave it a 2, 1, or 0 out of 5. That's wild to me. It's very rare that we see that type of rating on this question.
Well, I'm kind of floored by that as well, because I would definitely not have given it a 4 or a 5. I might have given it a 3 or a 2, but again, that roast character does take it slightly out of style. But I'm even surprised that Musty Phenolic Taster didn't rate it a 0 or a 1 or something, because that's definitely not included in the style.
Old Musty Phenolic guy. I wondered the same thing. Whenever I see somebody note an off flavor, but then there's nobody rating like represent style or their preference is a 0, I'm always like, okay, this is weird. Like maybe they did have a misunderstanding or something, or they thought they had to select an off flavor, even though we say that it's optional. Regardless, when asked how much you actually like this beer, in essence, would you order another one? 9 out of 21 people rated their preference as a 5 out of 5. Another 9, so there's 18, rated a 4 out of 5. One person gave it a 3 out of 5. One gave it a 2 out of 5. That's probably musty phenolic, dude. And then nobody rated it a 1 or a 0. Or one person did give it a 0 out of 5. Nobody gave it a 1. So there's your 21. 18 people, 4 or 5 out of 5. Crazy.
I would give it a 5 out of 5. This beer, although not a great Czech Amber Lager, was a delicious and wonderful beer. So I really did enjoy it.
Well, and that you make a good point. We ask how well it represents the style, and we keep that separate from, well, how much did you just like the beer, regardless of how well it represented the style? And that's what we're seeking there. So I have to imagine that some of the people who maybe didn't rate it as being terribly representative of the style, even though they all seemed it was pretty close, still liked the beer an awful lot. And I think that's pretty neat. Now, based on the blind taster evaluation of this beer, as well as your own impressions, Will, that it sounded like this beer might have been a little bit more roasty than expected. And, maybe it wasn't. It sounds like you and I are on the same page. This may not have been the most spot on example of a Czech Amber Lager, just because it was a little bit too dark, maybe a little too roasty, but clearly you enjoyed it. Other people seem to enjoy it. And that just goes to show that a tasty lager can be produced using this method. And we're not telling people they have to do it. I do have a question. If you were to go back and do anything different to bring this version of Czech Amber Lager more close to the BJCP style, what would you do?
I think the first thing I would do is I would probably, instead of doing all Pilsner, I would likely... I'd probably do the Maris Otter trick and do like a 50-50 Pilsner Maris Otter split. And then maybe I still like the chocolate rye in it, but either cut it out or just greatly reduce it and then up the crystal a little bit based off of that. I think that would be, I think the roundedness of the Maris Otter might kind of help play off the chocolate rye a little better. And then a little bit more sweetness from the crystal would help kind of subdue that roast character.
Yeah, I'm looking at your recipe right now again, and I would ditch any chocolate malt in this beer. And other than that, I think if you were just to drop that chocolate rye, it would bring this thing right into style guidelines. I mean, color wise, the flavor would still be there. You'd probably get a more pronounced sweetness because that dry, roasty character from the chocolate rye wouldn't be there, wouldn't be getting in the way. That would be my thing. I'd probably find some way to work in some pale chocolate just because of how much I love that kind of dry, nutty, toasty thing it contributes. But otherwise, I mean, I like your recipe. Would you do anything different with the hopping? Do you think you would go back and add Magnum instead? And also, we never got to new shoe character. It sounds like you didn't detect that at all.
I never detected new shoe. I think I would probably keep the hopping close to the same. Maybe supplement a little bit of Magnum just so I don't have to burn through quite as much Sots. But I would probably keep most of the hopping generally the same. It turned out it was a really delicious beer. It would be hard for me to want to brew it that much differently anyways. And so I know we talked about roast characters and all that, but do you want to talk about how I submitted this to a local competition and how well it did there?
Yes. Tell us about it.
So here in San Antonio, we have the Alamo City Cervecera Festival. It's a part of the Lone Star Circuit here in Texas. The Bear Brewers is a local club that puts it on. And so I actually, just for fun, submitted it as both a Czech Amber Lager and a Czech Dark Lager. And so needless to say, it didn't score too well as an amber lager. The comment was too roasty. I think it scored right around a 25, 26, somewhere in there, which is about, they didn't note any noticeable flaws in fermentation and stuff like that. Just it wasn't to style, wrong category. And so I think at 25, 26 is about what one can reasonably expect from entering it in the wrong style.
Yeah. I still very cool in my opinion, and I do that all the time. We've talked about approaches to competing in the past, and I have no issues entering the same beer into various styles. So
the dark lager though, this is the fun part, is it actually scored in the low 40s and got a third place medal.
I love it that your Czech Amber Lager scored in the low 40s on a Czech Dark Lager, and it was brewed using these methods. I mean that's going to ruffle some feathers of some people out there who are spending 8 hours on a brew day trying to make these styles. Now I get it. I think we say this more than enough, but I'm sure that those people out there who are taking every effort to make these types of styles, Czech Amber Lager, any type of lager for that matter, using traditional methods and they're minding, all of these different components, are likely producing some very, very world-class beers, no doubt. But you got away with making a Czech Amber / Dark Lager that was well received by nearly everybody. You enjoyed, and most importantly, your wife loved it. And I think that's awesome. So,
And it was 4 different judges on all the score sheets, and nobody noted like bad yeast character or anything like that. All the things that you would expect would show up, especially from a BJCP certified judge, which I know we get criticized for not always going with like certified judges and this and that. But none of them made any notes about bad fermentation characteristics or anything like that. So obviously you can make a clean, delicious beer using these methods.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. Well, just one comment to get to. It comes from Pablo54, who says, great write-up. I love the Short and Shoddy series. I traveled through the Czech Republic about 7 years ago, and every beer I had seemed better than the last one. You are making me so excited, Pablo. I noticed, quote, earthy stood out by a large margin for the hop flavor in your beer. To be honest, I don't understand the phrase earthy when it comes to describing a hop characteristic. It seems very broad to me. Could the volume of hops used have anything to do with it? I ask only because I made a very light cream ale last spring using spalt hops, that's another noble hop, at 2.8% alpha acid, and had to add a little over 4 ounces. It tasted a bit like lawn clippings. Will, maybe you have a different version of what earthy means, but to me, earthy is kind of it tastes the way dry dirt smells, which isn't bad. That sounds like, oh, who wants to eat dirt? But dirt kind of has like this, sweet kind of scent to it. Kind of reminds me a little bit of mushrooms. It is not a bad thing. It's just not spicy. It's not floral. It's not fruity. It has this just kind of earthy kind of character to it. Now, I don't know if I'm describing that the way everybody else experiences earthy.
So the last time I experienced earthy in a beer, a buddy of mine, we did like just an amber ale, and we used a pretty fair charge of Will Lovell. And I got, for whatever reason, from the first beer I cracked open there, it was, again, it tasted kind of like, dry dirt smells, kind of that, again, mushroomy dirt character. And it's not that it was like bad or unpleasant.
Yeah.
Now, granted, he let it sit another week and it tasted better a week later. But maybe not what you want to be the dominant flavor in your beer, but like as an undertone, especially to a malty style, it can be quite delicious.
Yeah, I agree. And if I'm tasting lawn clippings, if I'm judging a beer, at a competition, and I detect lawn clippings, that's where I'm marking off grassy. I would call that grassy. So to me, that is not necessarily earthy. There are some off flavors that can also kind of emulate what some might perceive as earthy, like pumpkin flesh is acetaldehyde. That's how I experience it. And that can have kind of an earthy thing to it as well. Though I do think they're distinct. So it's just one of those things. If earthy isn't what works for you, Pablo, use some other terminology. That's perfectly fine. So, well, I think that about covers Czech Amber Lager. Will, is there anything else before we wrap up that you'd like to add?
No, I just, Short and Shoddy is really what got me into brewlosophy and following brewlosophy. And just because you don't want to do an entire Short and Shoddy batch, if you want to cut some corners, do a slightly reduced mash time, do a slightly reduced boil. You can do all sorts of little things and take notes from what we've done on these just to save some time in your brew day.
Yeah.
Which really helps out. Again, if you have wife, kids, whatever, life happens. And these, let us show you some corners to cut, and you don't have to do all of it or take it to the extreme, but just, shaving 10, 15 minutes here or there can make a difference.
Absolutely. If you are a busy person, if you are, a partner of somebody who doesn't brew as often as you do, then you know the feeling of wanting to spend 6 hours in the garage to make a batch of beer when your partner might want to go somewhere else and do something else, whatever. If you can knock a batch out, in the 2 hours before your partner wakes up in the morning, how rad is that? So, don't be afraid to cut a few corners. You don't have to go to the extent that we do, but a lot of this stuff doesn't seem to have much of a qualitative impact, and I think that's pretty cool. So, well, don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab, our podcast where host Cade Job takes you into the lab with brewing experts. And just a heads up, he recently made what we think is a pretty rad change to the show. Instead of doing a deep dive with a new guest every single week, he and co-host Jordan Folks, another Brewlosophy contributor, are going to be getting together every other week to talk about the information from the episode published the week prior. Their hope being to make it a little bit more digestible to the common listener. This is purely a function of Cade listening to listener feedback, taking it to heart. So if you found yourself scratching your head when listening to past episodes of the Brew Lab, make sure you take a listen now. They are going to be breaking down that stuff every other week, and they're what they're calling the Applying the Science episodes. We're pretty stoked for that. And always remember that you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this Short and Shoddy Czech Amber Lager.
The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no